Imagine it's June 14th, 2013. The lights are low, the house is quiet, and you finally started the game that everyone's been talking about. 20 minutes in, and it's already broken your heart. You don't know it yet, but you're playing what a lot of people will spend the next decade calling one of the greatest games ever made. Now spin the calendar back 26 years. Same date, June 14th, 1987. And in Japan, Mario is teeing off on a floppy disk almost nobody outside the country will ever touch. One date, 26 years apart. Two completely different worlds of play. And that's just one day of this week. We've also got the end of Solid Snake, a shapeshifter tearing Manhattan apart, and the strangest, luckiest day on Nintendo's entire calendar. We're talking about all this and more on This Week in Video Game History. Welcome back, everyone. I'm your host, Doug Coleman, and this week we are covering June 8th through June 14th. It's a week that gave us a gloriously chaotic medieval brawler, a shape-shifting monster tearing apart Manhattan, the end of one of gaming's most legendary stories, a Kirby game you played without ever pressing a button, a forgotten Mario Golf disc that only ever existed in Japan, and one of the most acclaimed games ever made, and two of those games somehow share the exact same date. Plus 3 stories worth slowing down for. The slow motion collapse of a beloved publisher, the rise and fall of the biggest show in games, and the single weirdest, luckiest day in Nintendo's entire calendar. So grab your controller and press start to continue. Picture 64 people in full medieval armor, screaming, on fire, sprinting at each other across a burning castle courtyard. That's not a cutscene. That's just a Tuesday. On June 8th, 2021, Torn Banner Studios released Chivalry 2, a multiplayer melee brawler with absolutely no interest in being dignified about it. You're swinging broadswords and battle axes and massive first-person sieges, hacking off limbs, catapulting flaming cows over castle walls, and getting decapitated mid-sentence by someone you never saw coming. It launched the same day across PlayStation, Xbox, and PC with full crossplay, which in 2021 still felt like a genuine luxury. The rare game where it didn't matter what box your friends owned. But the detail that tells you exactly who made this game is the brawl mode, where the only weapons allowed are things like a fish, a chair, a rolling pin, a bottle, and a turkey leg. 4 players beating each other senseless with groceries. This is Monty Python with a development budget. It's the loudest, dumbest, most joyfully committed way I could think of to open our week. And every one of those words is a compliment. You wake up on a slab in a morgue. You don't know your name. You don't know how you got there. And you're about to learn you can turn your own arms into swords. That's the cold open of Prototype, released on June 9th, 2009. And the man on the slab is Alex Mercer. Developed by Radical Entertainment and published by Activision, this dropped you into a Manhattan being eaten alive by a viral outbreak called Blacklight, and then handed you the keys to the whole island. You could sprint straight up a face of a skyscraper, hijack a helicopter in midair, or grab a stranger off the sidewalk and absorb them whole, taking their shape. Restraint was simply not on the menu. It was loud. It was gory. It was that very specific late 2000s flavor of open world power fantasy where the entire pitch was, here's a city, here's a monster, you're the monster, have fun. It reviewed solidly, sold around 2 million copies and got a sequel a few years later. Radical sadly didn't last much longer. Activision quietly dismantled the studio in 2012, one more name on a long list of teams that got folded into nothing. But for one summer in 2009, Being the most dangerous thing in New York City was about as good a time as gaming offered. This one's a goodbye, and the timing was no accident. Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriot launched June 12th, 2008, exactly 10 years to the day after the original Metal Gear Solid. Hideo Kojima was saying farewell to Solid Snake, the character he'd built his entire career around. Except now he's old Snake, gray, coughing, his body prematurely aged into his 60s by the cloning that created him. Dragged out of retirement for one final mission against the man he spent his entire life chasing. It was a PlayStation 3 exclusive, and an unapologetic showcase for the hardware, and it became legendary. Or infamous, depending on who you ask. For cutscenes so long they crossed into folklore. The ending sequence alone runs the better part of 90 minutes. People made jokes. People also did not get up from the couch. Because here's the thing. It landed. After 20 years of a story tying itself into increasingly impossible knots, Kojima untied every single one of them and gave one of the most iconic characters this medium has ever produced an ending that genuinely felt earned. Not many franchises get to say goodbye on their own terms with the original creator at the wheel. This one did. June 12th, 2008. Here's a Kirby game you played without ever once moving Kirby. On June 13th, 2005, HAL Laboratory released Kirby Canvas Curse on the Nintendo DS, and the whole conceit is that they took your control of Kirby away. No D-pad steering him around, no jump button. Instead, they rolled him into a little ball and gave you a stylus and a rainbow. You draw a line across the touchscreen, and Kirby would roll along it, over a pit, around a spike, looping straight up a wall and across the ceiling. Tap him directly, and he dashed towards his enemies. This was one of the earliest games to look at the strange second screen and the stylus and decide they weren't a gimmick. That you could build a genuinely great platformer out of drawing instead of jumping. And it worked. It's still one of the most quietly inventive games on the system. In Europe, it got a better name, honestly. Kirby Power Paintbrush. But either way, it's a small reminder that sometimes the most creative thing a designer can do is take the controls away and hand you a brush instead. Our obscure pick of the week, and the first of two games sharing one date. On June 14th, 1987, in Japan, Nintendo released Famicom Golf US Course, starring Mario and Luigi out on the green on courses modeled after the real United States. It came out on the Famicom Disk System, Nintendo's floppy disk add-on that launched in 1986, offered more storage than cartridges, and never once left Japan. And I know, on paper, Mario plays golf on a floppy disk is not exactly a headline. But stay with me, because this little disk could phone home. It was compatible with something called the Disk Fax, a kiosk you'd find in Japanese stores where you could upload your high scores directly to Nintendo and compete in national tournaments. A live national leaderboard. In 1987, years before online meant anything to a console player. And if you won one of those contests, Nintendo mailed you back a rare gold-colored copy of the disc, a prize so scarce that collectors still hunt them to this day. So, a Mario game almost nobody outside of Japan ever saw, quietly running a national online scoreboard 2 decades before the rest of the industry caught up. That's exactly the kind of forgotten little miracle this show exists for. Same date, June 14th, but spin the calendar forward 26 years, from that obscure little golf disc to this. On June 14th, 2013, Naughty Dog, the studio behind Uncharted, released The Last of Us. It's the story of Joel, a smuggler scraped hollow by grief, hired to escort a teenager named Ellie across the United States that a fungal pandemic had quietly brought to an end. It was brutal and it was tender, often in the same breath. and it was carried by the sparse, aching guitar score from Gustavo Santaolalla that sounded like Lost itself. It sold over 1 million copies in its first week. It swept Game of the Year awards up and down the industry. A decade later, it became one of the most acclaimed shows on television. But the part that matters most is when it arrived. The absolute twilight of the PlayStation 3. A console that should have had nothing left to prove. And Naughty Dog used those last drops of horsepower to make the case that a video game could carry the full emotional weight of any film ever made. June 14th, 2013, 26 years to the day after Mario was faxing golf scores to Nintendo, was the day a whole lot of people quietly stopped arguing about whether games were art. In the teaser, I called June 11th the strangest, luckiest day on Nintendo's entire calendar. Let me show you what I mean. Start with the hardware. On June 11th, 2001, Nintendo launched the Game Boy Advance in North America. Then, 5 years later to the day, on June 11th, 2006, they launched the Nintendo DS Lite in North America. Two handhelds, the engines of two different eras, both arriving on the exact same date, half a decade apart. Once it's a coincidence, twice starts to feel like a habit. But it's what else that lands on June 11th that I really love, because it's where Nintendo keeps dropping its weirdest experiments. On June 11th, 2007, Big Brain Academy on the Wii, a game that literally tries to weigh your brain. June 11th, 2015 in Japan, Rhythm Heaven Megamix, a rhythm game about, among other things, an onion that needs its face shaved. And June 11th, 2021, Game Builder Garage, a Nintendo game whose entire purpose is to teach you how to make your own games. Handheld and Oddities, the same date, over and over for 20 years. There's a real story in why Nintendo keeps betting on the strange, and we'll save the full version of that for another time. Here's a story that didn't make the timeline because it isn't a game. It's the near death of a company that gave us some of the best games ever made. If you've played PC RPGs in the 90s, you owe Interplay a debt. Fallout, Baldur's Gate, Descent, Earthworm Jim. Their motto was by gamers for gamers. And by the first week of June 2004, they were nearly a corpse. That week, California state labor officials walked into Interplay's offices in Irvine for a surprise inspection. And what they found shut the company down on the spot. Employees hadn't been paid in over a month. There were no workers' compensation insurance. On top of that, Interplay owed something like $179,000 in back taxes, over $400,000 in unpaid rent, and was being sued by BioWare over Baldur's Gate's royalties. The state told them that legally, they could not let employees keep working. And then, days later, on June 9th, 2004, the CEO scrambled together the insurance and the doors reopened. Interplay thankfully did not die that week. The rise and fall of one of gaming's great publishers is a story worth telling properly another day. There's a reason so much gaming history happens in June, and it has a name, E3. For a couple of decades, the Electronics Entertainment Expo was the center of the gaming universe. Every June, the entire industry would descend on the Los Angeles Convention Center, and for 3 or 4 days, the biggest companies on Earth would try to outshout each other. Surprise reveals, megaton trailers, grown adults losing their minds over a logo. If you loved games, E3 week was your Super Bowl, your Christmas, and your World Cup all at once. And then it just stopped. The publishers started pulling out one by one, deciding they didn't need a crowded convention floor when they could just stream a polished video straight to your phone. Your Nintendo Directs, your PlayStation showcases, your Summer Game Fest. The pandemic shoved E3 online entirely, And in June 2021, it held what quietly turned out to be the last real event. In 2023, it was officially canceled for good. The biggest stage in gaming went dark. How the show that defined an industry lost its reason to exist, that's an episode all of its own. And it's a fitting place to leave off this week because if there's a thread running through all these 7 days, it's goodbye. Imagine it's June 14th, 1987. Somewhere in Japan, a kid feeds a floppy disk into a Famicom Disk System, plays a few rounds of golf as Mario, and then carries that disk down to a kiosk to fax his high scores to Nintendo, so that the whole country can see what he shot. He has no idea he's doing something the rest of the world won't manage for another 20 years. He just knows he wants to be on the board. Now jump forward 26 years, same date, and a different person sets down a controller for the final scene of The Last of Us, and just sits there in the dark for a while, not ready to talk about it yet. Same day on the calendar, two completely different worlds of play, and one quiet through line connecting them. People building things that outlived the moment they were made for. Because that's the thing about this week. Interplay nearly died in an empty office in Irvine, and the games they made are still being played tonight. E3 went dark, the biggest stage gaming ever had, and everything it used to do now happens on the screen in your pocket. A monster tore Manhattan apart, a pink ball rolled down a painted line, and a golf disc ran a national leaderboard before online meant anything at all. This medium keeps ending things. Consoles, studios, conventions, whole eras, and somehow it never stops making new ones. That's the part I never get tired of. That's it for this episode. Thank you all so much for sticking around. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe over on YouTube or follow the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. It genuinely helps. Artwork for the show is done by Ms. Tink. Music is produced by Shane Mandini. Go follow him on Twitch and Spotify and listen to all his great work. The show is written, produced, and hosted by me, Doug Coleman. Be sure to save your game, nerds. I'll see you next week.